Hello and welcome. My name is Sean Swanik. I'm the librarian for Middle East, North Africa, and Islamic Studies. Today's session will focus on the politics of translating Arabic literature, a field of immense complexities and rather politically charged at times. What gets translated by and for whom are some of the questions our esteemed guests shall elaborate upon today. Before I introduce today's guests, I would be remiss if I did not thank our sponsors, the Duke Middle East Studies Center, the Duke Islamic Studies Center, and the Duke University Libraries, a very Duke affair. Thanks also to Griffin Orlando. A quick word about format. Our guests will ask probing questions to each other, discussing some of the challenges each have faced and contemplated. Upon the conclusion of their discussion, we will open the floor, as it were, to questions from you, today's audience. To ask a question, feel free to raise your hand and I will call upon you, or feel free, if you are shy, to ask your question in chat and I'll read it on your behalf. Without further ado, our guests, in alphabetical order. Dr. Dima Ayub is an assistant professor of Arabic at Middlebury College, where she is also the CV Star Endowed Junior Faculty in International Studies. Her teaching and research interests include modern Arabic literature, critical translation studies, gender and sexuality, Arab cinema and visual culture, diaspora studies, and digital humanities. Her current research focuses on the relationship between Arabic literature and the post-World War II knowledge practices of Anglo-American translation. Her upcoming book, Paratext and Power, Modern Arabic Literature and Translation, rewrites the social and cultural history of modern Arabic literature and translation by centering the role of paratext, so glossaries, forewords, afterwords, introductions, in addition to publishers, translators, and writers. She has, in recent years, developed a digital archive of modern Arabic literature in English, French, German, and Spanish translation. Some of her publications have appeared in the Journal of Arabic Literature, Journal of Middle Eastern Literatures in Translation Studies. Dr. Alexandra Schleite, a graduate of Yale University, is Mellon Bridge Assistant Professor of Arabic and International Literary and Visual Studies at Tufts University. Her academic work is at the intersection of transnational literature, literary history and theory, visual studies, race and ethnicity studies, women and gender studies, environmental studies, queer studies, and disability studies. Her current book project, tentatively titled Other Realisms, A Theory of Arabic Fantastic, examines a seismic shift in Arabic political aesthetics that, through activating the realm of the supernatural, renders visible those who remained in the shadows of the Arab post-colonial project, ethnic, religious, gender, and sexual minorities, as well as people with disabilities, migrant workers, and refugees. In addition to her academic work, she is the author of 2 novels in Arabic, Always Coca-Cola and Ali and His Russian Mother. Her novels have been translated to English, German, and French. And last, but certainly not least, Dr. Michelle Hartman is professor of Arabic literature and the director of the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill University. She is also a literary translator from Arabic to English who focuses mainly on the works of Arab women authors, including Alexandra Schleite's 2 novels, Always Coca-Cola and Ali and His Russian Mother. Hello and welcome. Thanks so much for being here. I'm so glad we were able to organize this. A little bit of background for the audience. We've been in discussion for almost a year now, trying to figure out when we could do this. So thanks so much for coming, and I'll let you take it away.
It was like a very long engagement.
A fun engagement.
Yeah.
Thank you for that introduction, Sean. So let me just say a few words about the rationale for, why we came together. The 3 of us have known each other in multiple different ways. Michelle translated Alexandra's first novel, Always Coca-Cola, which, it's a 10-year anniversary actually of that novel. I was heavily involved in the translation process with Michelle by editing and reading the original and translation side by side. So while I didn't work directly with Alexandra during that time, my work on Always Coca-Cola certainly played a role in how we came to know each other later as colleagues and friends. So that's why the three of us are of course together, and of course we're interested in similar questions around Arabic literature. So just to reiterate what Sean said about the structure, the way it's going to go is each of us will lead with a question, and then each will have a chance to respond to each other's questions and comments. And so I wanted to start us off by reflecting on the question of power differences between Arabic and its translation into English and other European languages. Of course, power differences extend beyond the linguistic realm to include gender, class, nationality, race, education, but even, I think, highly contingent factors like one's sense of entitlement, or whether someone's an extrovert or an introvert, or the kinds of negotiating skills one has, and so on. I think these also play a role in how power differences are deployed and negotiated within translation practices. We can list a number of examples where the dynamic between authors and translators hinge upon, intricate considerations that determine who can say or do what in a given context. And so I want to kind of relate this, to the kind of work I've been doing over the last decade. I've been conducting a mix of qualitative research and a host of interviews with translators, publishers, and editors of Arabic literature, of course, in addition to close reading. And based on this research, I'm thinking about, the changes that have occurred over time, but also some of the elements that have remained the same. So, for example, when we think about what some call the boom of translated literature from Arabic, one of the questions I'm interested in is whether this has necessarily resulted in, better practices in translation, or it has the, understanding of Arabs and the Arab world, improved. What kind of diversity, beyond the kind of national framework, what other diversities are we also including in the canon of Arabic literature? It used to be that translators, translated too much Egyptian fiction, and now it's too much Syrian fiction, right? So in a way, we haven't moved beyond the national framework and the question of representation. And I'm hoping we can talk about some of the ways that publishers are still very much invested in a framework of representation. I have many stories to share based on what translators have told me, in interviews. And just last spring, a very prominent translator of Arabic literature was asked, to suggest titles for translation to a big European publisher. And of course, a lot of us know how this narrative goes, right? She suggests names of authors that are perhaps less well known in English, and the publisher comes back and says, well, what about Nawal al-Saadawi? There's that one book that hasn't been translated from Arabic. And so I suppose, this is not surprising for many of us, but I'd love for us to reflect on, what it is that we're translating in the West. In a way, it seems that we're somewhat out of touch with what the Arabic readership is interested in. Who are we translating for, and to what end? And I think part of the answer to this question is that, either the academics or translators who are translating and determining what books are, translated into English, are based in a kind of Euro-American context. And I think this raises questions of, the relationship of the kind of Euro-American academic or translator to the object of their study. What is their relationship to it and their positionality with regards to it? I don't think we talk enough about these aspects in the field of Arabic literature. So, I'd love to turn to Michelle and Alexandra, and, just to reflect together, how are you thinking about these questions of which texts are being translated, in which context? How does the politicization of literature work in the translation process, for the translator? And just in general, reflecting on the kind of the task that translators of Arabic literature, the tasks that they're faced with. We think of, there's a kind of charge, I think, in the scholarship, a kind of call to arms that our scholarship proposes. So I'll turn it over to you, and then, yeah, I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about that.
So when we were talking about this, when we were preparing for this, and hi, everybody, and thanks for coming. I see there's almost 60 people here, and it's really nice to see so many people. And so just sort of, even just the people that I know who are there are from like all different places. We've got like Ankara, right? So hi, and my mom. So hi, everybody. And really thanks for coming. But I told Dima and Alexandra before this that maybe I would start off my kind of comments by just taking like a second to reflect back on sort of like how I became a translator, or like what was the thing that made me become a translator, because I think it kind of fits in a little bit with Dima's question. Not that everybody's path is the same, but there's certain elements of this that are we see kind of come again and again, and within kind of Arabic English literary translation. And I first translated a novel together with a friend, and I was a student studying at the University of Damascus, and he had graduated from University of Damascus, and we were just friends. And he was really obsessed with this one novel and wanted to share it with people who didn't know Arabic. So he just wanted to kind of do it to kind of like show his friends and people who he knew around, maybe, or other people in the world who couldn't read Arabic, this thing that he felt really expressed to him in his life. And so we did it kind of like just for fun. Okay. And we did it for fun, and we like got together, we spent kind of like a weekend workshop. We did it in this, and we shared it with people who we knew, and I put it in a drawer. I never really thought about it again. And then a while later, we were talking, we're like, let's send it to a publisher and see if they'll publish it. We kind of did it like that. And that's how I got into translating Arabic. So you see, it's like a little bit of like, what was the word, serendipity, or just it was a little bit random in a certain way. I mean, it wasn't. I was studying Arabic literature, but I think that Dima's point that she finished with there about this idea that we translate Arabic because we have a call to do it, or a charge to do it, or a responsibility to do it, or there's some kind of idea of a duty to do it, is something that comes, like for me, personally came kind of next, but that does affect, like, I would say a lot of people who are translators of Arabic, right? By the time I did the next novel, I was a teacher, right? I was a professor. I mean, I was a scholar of Arabic literature. I was a professor. I was approached because I had done this first one to do this next one. And, I had that thing, oh, well, okay, but that would be another text we could teach. It would be another text that people could use it, so this was very much a part of my own life, and just becoming a translator, like that's real. And then, subsequent texts, I mean, we can talk about them later, they came in different ways, and I was asked to do them and so on. But, this idea, I think, is quite important, that so many of us in translating feel that like we should do it, or we must do it, or we're compelled to do it for these different reasons. And again, they're slightly different for different people, but it exists within the field, some notion of, I don't know if I want to call it kind of, duty is the word that keeps coming to mind, but like so many people are teachers or professors, or feel that there's another kind of strand of like wanting to like bridge, build a bridge, change a stereotype, right? This isn't so much how I got into it, but I think this idea, like we do translation to kind of challenge assumptions. We do translations to change the politics, right? So in a field like Arabic literature, particularly in the United States and other English-speaking environments, there's an idea of obviously, anti-Arab racism, a lot of prejudice. We're in a charged political environment, and so there is a notion that exists within our field that somehow these translations are, or doing translation will somehow engage that, challenge it or something. So that, I think, Dima, your point there is taken. I believe you're right that this exists and we don't really talk about it and we don't really analyze it a lot. Right. So you were pointing out that kind of dynamic whereby we reproduce certain ideas, because it's another thing, we tend to, so we say we're doing diversity, we say we're challenging stereotypes, but at the same time we do that, then we also produce other ones by the kind of, if we want to call it streaming, or by the way that process by which things get translated, which you alluded to, right? So there's this process whereby, the text is translated, the text is solicited, and who gets to pick and how the choices are done. And is the choice on the part of publishers? Is that a small publisher? Is that a big publisher? Is that a big corporation? Is that a little small group of people? Is it the translator? Is it the author pushing their text? How those relationships work, which again, we can talk about as we go along, right? But that's certainly a really important part of the whole issue that we're talking about, that I think is really important to draw out more. I think most of us aren't that, if we're not in the process, we might not be that aware of how, and all the different steps that it goes through and all the different things that shape. It's not just a translator or just an author or just a publisher, right? It's all of those things and how they work together, that produce what we're doing. And I was going to say one other thing before I was getting, I know it's get Alexandra's in that as well. But just before that, I was going to say one other small point. I don't know if this takes us a little bit to the side, but we can always kind of circle back to it. But it's also this idea about kind of the boom. And so there's an idea about the boom that we have, so much, translated. And of course, there's more has been translated than before. And Dima, you obviously know more about this because you've done these studies, but it's interesting to think about, where those things are and what, if it means a change. And I guess I feel like at the same time, there is more, so there's objectively more, there's more actual books. A change in a big sense isn't something that I've really observed too much, right? There are small changes, right? So it's also about talking, there are little individual changes, but if we look at a larger analysis, I'm not sure how much of a change there really is in the big picture. And I was going to add to that one other tiny point, which is thinking about who we assume the readership of Arabic literature in translation is. And so again, I'm looking at the 66 people on Zoom, and I'm going to guess if we sat down and kind of did a little, mini demographic study of the 66 people who came on a Friday, whatever time it is, wherever you are, day, that you are coming from all different places with all different kinds of interests and all different backgrounds, and right, so maybe you're, if you 66 are our ideal readership, then what conclusion would we draw from you, right? And I think this all the time because I look at my classes who are obviously a readership of Arabic literature and translation because I assign these texts to them and they're forced to read them, and that is not a unified demographic either, right? It would be really hard, to draw out, oh, these people are all this is what they want, so we kind of have an idea when we're publishing Arabic literature, either explicitly or implicitly articulated to us, that we are translating for this reader, okay? And in the production of this text that we're doing, so we're translating it, we're editing it, we're marketing it, we're putting it between covers, we're putting a blurb on the back, we're putting it on, the internet to advertise it. And I sound like a grandma when I say it like that, right? But whatever. But that's this process, and who that ideal reader is, I think, is often assumed to be an imaginary figure that I'm not sure is the reader, right? You know, if there even is one, right? Because what I observe of people who talk to me or people who I talk to, who would be, you know, like all of you, this readership, it's not a person who is sitting in a little small town somewhere in the United States of America that has never heard of the places that we're talking about, who's never eaten the foods that are being described in the book. And, you know, is this kind of like imaginary, you know, I was joking with Dima about this, right? There's like this imaginary kind of white man sitting in a village in a small, you know, place in America in the middle, and who's never heard of any of these things. And I'm not sure that's our ideal readership, but somehow that seems to be in a lot of the process of the translating and marketing and promoting the books. Somehow that's the image that we're supposed to assume that this person is. And I'm not sure that that's the person who should be in our minds as the person we're translating for. So those were the points I was going to put out about that question, and see what Alexandra thinks about those ones, or Dimas as well.
Thanks, Dima. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, everybody, for organizing this and for coming. And I really love all the points that you made, and especially, Dima, what you said about the boom and, you know, the fact that there are so many more works that are being translated. It's kind of like more of a flood, especially after the events that we tend to call the Arab Spring or the Arab Revolts or whatever you would like to call them. And I love what you said, Michelle, about the ideal reader, because I really want to talk about the ideal writer in a way, or what it feels like the ideal writer could be. And I also want to talk about the readership of Arabic literature and translation. Maybe I'll bring it up a little bit later, but your idea about the readership is really important. And I think it's really kind of central to think about that in terms of media as well, and how, you know, like kind of the internet and streaming services, how they're changing who gets to consume, and how Arabic literature kind of arrives at your doorstep or on your screen, or, you know, in your mailbox or whatever. So I'll address that a bit later, but I do want to talk about this, you know, like these expectations from authors from the global South, or especially authors who are women or who identify as women or who are thought of to be women. We need to really break down this category of women, by the way. But, you know, there's this expectation to kind of write about the lives and struggles of women from their countries. And kind of tied to that expectation is this sort of de facto label of oppression or struggle, you know, and within that, it's kind of coupled with the expectation to write in genres that are closer to realism than to kind of, let's say, genre fiction or speculative fiction, for example, is this sort of thin veil, or the illusion of this thin veil between the text and reality that realism creates is really important for our ethnographic understanding of, you know, wherever this book is coming from. And the reason why this is really interesting for me is, well, two things. First of all, my third novel right now is a novel in genre. I try to do several things with genre. It kind of moves from climate apocalypse to the sort of examination of what gender means, to a murder mystery, and it's presented as a TV show with commercial breaks and things like that. So I'm really thinking a lot about genre. And a friend and I actually had a discussion just yesterday. We were trying to come up with a list of novels in Arabic that kind of are about environmental disaster. And of course, we found a few, and but it was really difficult to think about writers who were not men, who've been translated to English, or maybe not translated to English, but who write about environmental disasters. So kind of, there's this sort of implicit expectation that your book can't really be about space travel. It has to be more autobiographical. And that kind of adds one more kind of layer to this sort of realist game that everybody's playing, I think. And my question, especially for the translators, but also for everybody, I guess I'm really interested to hear about what people think about that. How do we understand this sort of pressure for realism, this pressure for this illusion of the real, when genre fiction is having a really global moment of explosion? So in terms of translation into English, there's so many genre novels that are being translated now. And I don't mean Scandinavian crime fiction that did have a moment in the early 2000s, but sci-fi fiction from Asia, from China especially. I'm reading The Three-Body Problem right now and really enjoying it, if anybody would want to talk about that. But so what would genre writing look like in Arabic with those expectations in mind in terms of translation? And what would it look like in English translation? And obviously those are really really open-ended questions that I would like to explore together if we get the chance. And it's really important to also mention that genre is kind of having a moment in Arabic as well. Like Ahmad Saadawi's Frankenstein in Baghdad, for better or for worse, is very clear about transplanting Mary Shelley to kind of post-invasion Iraq. Hassan Blassem's work also dips into the absurd and magical realism, and especially the work of Carlos Fuentes. And he has this short story called Ahlam Carlos Fuentes, the dreams of Carlos Fuentes. So we have these texts that are really openly dialoguing with genre fiction, or what we can call genre fiction, in other languages and world literature. And you know, the reason why genre, I think for me, is so interesting to bring up in our conversation about translation, because it's a way of translating. It's a way of kind of carrying over, a way for texts to kind of communicate across linguistic, temporal, geographical borders. Because what genre does is that it activates certain tropes and certain cues. Like when we're watching a horror film, we know that the murderer is probably coming to come in when we're showering, or when the main character is showering, or, you know, you can't go down the stairs into the basement and the character will do it anyway. So we know we're kind of, you know, like all of these texts are playing, and films are playing on our ability to kind of recognize something that we already know. And then maybe they do something with what we already know, maybe they don't, but we need to know something. And the question is, when it comes to kind of translating in genre, and genre as translation, is how do you recognize something you already know from a culture that you don't know? Right? Like, how does that work? And what was really interesting for me, I just taught in my literature class, I just taught Emil Habibi's Side, the Best Optimist. And Dima, maybe that could really connect with your work. I was just astounded by the number of footnotes that existed in the translation of that text, especially explaining all those pillars of classical sort of Arabic culture to an Anglophone reader. And we couldn't just read one passage together without having to go back to the footnotes and kind of, you know, so you know, on the surface, it appears as though genre is this way of bringing together and building bridges, like Michelle was saying, and communicating. But at the same time, it's maybe it's a false idea. In genres like magical realism, you kind of open yourself up to an archive of magic and monsters that may not be familiar to readers in another language. There's a book about sci-fi in Arabic that came out recently that is saying that has nothing to do basically with the sci-fi in English, right? Like the audience is different, the temporal kind of progression of the genre is different. We don't have genre in Arabic in the same way. Does that give us more or less freedom? What does it mean for us when we are translated? How do we understand, you know, translation with this kind of landscape of genre fiction that's invading the markets in mind? So, yeah, I mean, maybe I'm asking more questions than I'm answering, but I can also share my experiences with having been translated if people are interested. But I'm also really interested in having a discussion about these things.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much here to talk about, so many links, and, you know, in a way, like, where do we locate, I think, some of these problems, and I am going to call them problems, because I think in a way, there was something wrong, and I'll put this in the past tense, there was something wrong with the way that Arabic literature was presented as a field of study. You know, I certainly was trained through that kind of problematic lens. You know, it was you know, studied as something, you know, outside of literature that's a metaphor or a symbol for something else, right? So, for example, a lot of us are familiar with this kind of narrative of the rise and fall of Arabic literature, right? That was very much central to, you know, how Arabic literature as a field was framed. And I think it, you know, thankfully, you know, post-colonial studies came around, you know, and I think it was until that sort of emerged and really influenced how we studied Arabic literature that I think that kind of narrative of the rise and fall of Arabic literature started to kind of be taken apart. You know, Arabic literature, you know, I think became a metaphor for everything that was wrong with the Arab world, you know, and I do think that part of the problem and part of what you're sort of, you know, your thirst for this other way, right? These alternatives that I think it seems so unimaginable, right? But why, right? You know, there are these kinds of almost roadblocks, I think, that keep insisting on reorienting the literature in one particular way. And we know the stories, right? I mean, Samar Yazbek, for example, was, I don't want to use like strong language, but was forced to change the genre of, to change genres, basically, to publish the translation of, I think it was The Crossing, into a memoir, right? It wasn't written as a memoir, right? So we hear these stories, and not to kind of, not to single out, of course, any prize in particular. But I do think the prizes are a part of this problem, because there's a kind of prize culture that promotes uncritical translation at all expense. And there is a kind of frenzy around prizes, that's happening around translation, because there's this idea that, there are too few translatable texts and there are so many translators. So from what I've been hearing from the new generation of translators is that, there's a kind of cutthroat culture and competition, of who can get, the rights to a particular book, or who can get the most writers in their stable. You don't hear a lot of translators saying like, I don't want to translate anymore, except Michelle, of course. But there is a kind of situation where the whole institution of the agent doesn't exist, I think, in our field. I mean, it's starting to change, right, somewhat. But in a way, it's every translator for themselves. And the translational kind of frenzy goes around the prizes as well, right? So who gets nominated for the prizes, also, who's translated, is very important, because what people read in the Arab world is very different, I think, than what gets translated for English readers. And I think the market is very much oriented, towards like, who's the next hot talent, right? Whatever that is, that sometimes is attached to, to a political crisis, for example, right? Or something else. But I do think that there's a lot of talented authors, of course, producing great literature, but that don't receive any visibility because they're not part of the nominations and prizes apparatus, right? Which means that they're not getting the kind of recognition then also in their original language, in Arabic. And I think there's a vicious cycle here, because it means you have to be nominated or win a prize in order for anyone to take you seriously as a writer in your own country, in your own language, right? So not sure, Michelle, what your sense.
I mean, the prize thing, it's like, we just scratched the surface of it, right? I mean, like there's so, because the prizes also determine what gets translated. Like, so the prizes do so many things. And we're talking, I mean, I know there's different prizes, but some of the very big money prizes, right? The very prestigious prizes that are funded in different parts of the Gulf, right? These prizes also are kind of, so it's, when you win, let's say, a prize for the best Arabic novel, right? What you win, in addition to some money, is you get translated. So like we're putting translation, like translation is one of the things you win, right? And so it also becomes one of your goals, right? So like the way that translation is interpolated into the prize system, and I'm not talking about the translation prizes, these are the Arabic literary prizes but you see how they're connected together, right? And that's true of the Mahfouz Prize as well, right? Like one of the things you win is you get translated, and they help you, get translated, and those ones that get translated, those are the ones that then some of the translators will like fight for to get those translations, because you're translating something that you think is going to get promoted, right? So you're not going to translate something that's not going to, they're going to like promote it and sell it supposedly as well. And I think that so there's this also implication which is sort of addressing, but in a problematic way, what you're talking about, Dima, which is also that disconnect between what people are reading in the different contexts, is also, it's sort of implying that it's going to bring this together. And I mean, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but it certainly in the prize system with the money involved controls it, or it has something to do with controlling it, right? Because it's also kind of proposing, these are the things to read, these are the things that are worthy, and so on. I mean, I've been doing this in just, you know, with it as well, but I had the students kind of do an analysis of, you know, in a few different ways, and just like what was their observation of some of the prizes and the long list and the short list. And again, you know, without, you know, I don't have to draw the conclusions for you, go and Google it and look it up. You'll see some pretty visible of who's shortlisted, longlisted, and winning those prizes, you know, along the lines, as you said, of like gender, nationality, and when there's this kind of attempt to remedy some of the prejudices or the trends that are built into the system, then, you know, you get, you know, like a long list from all one country or something, right? So it's you know, it hinges on things that aren't necessarily what we might, you know, as like readers or critics or translators or authors want to see, right? So the prize thing, I think, is really really important to this. I was going to come back. I really wanted to come back to some of the things that Alexandra brought up, because, you know, as a really speak to me this question about like what you're allowed to write. And so like as a translator, like it's really interesting. I mean, I was thinking about, you know, you listed the Frankenstein in Baghdad piece, and the, you know, Hussein Blasim. Ibtisam Azam is a really interesting writer, the Book of Disappearance, which is a text, for example, that also has its, you know, again, is it sci-fi? I don't know if it's sci-fi, right? It's a genre that isn't exactly a genre, but it's some kind of a genre, and it's really, really interesting. The students who I taught loved it, right? Which shows that you can do things and be appreciated when you're writing something that isn't what you expect, and that's very different, you know, which is a really fascinating, you know, text. So this one really came to my mind. But I was thinking about it in relation to a text that I translated. Well, actually, two texts that I translated by the same author, Jeanne Al-Hassan. And so I translated two of her novels. One is called The 99th Floor, and one is called the English titles, oh God, what do we call it? Okay, we debated the title, All the Women Inside Me. And so we got a little tiny book review in the New York Times for the first one. And there's a line in that book review that essentially says, I'm paraphrasing, see the exact words, it's going to sound even worse than it actually is, but it's pretty much a la, we don't really care, as you know, we don't really care about the inner psychological lives of these characters. We really care about the important political moments that they're moving through, something like this. Okay. And this is a novel that is a psychological portrait. I mean, the novel is a really intense psychological study of two kind of people who've lived through a lot of really difficult things. The political and historical background that they're living against in Arabic is so cliched that it's so obvious. Like, you know, the book isn't about the thing that they lived through. I mean, the thing that they lived through creates them into these like people, and their psychology and how they live through it is what the book is about. And so like the New York Times literally is telling you as a reader that you don't care about what the book's actually doing, and that you should care about the part of the book that's actually the most kind of obvious or whatever. And, you know, and I bring it every semester now when I teach the students, so that they know that, you know, when you're reading Arabic literature, it's, you know, the reviews and the criticism or whatever is over determined to tell you the kind of like the opposite of what the novel itself probably is telling you. And I think, you know, it's really important for us in these conversations to think about this, because we are existing and we're reading, you know, all around us. I mean, I bring the New York Times book review example just as an example, because it's like one of the most mainstream reviews something I've worked on has ever gotten. But, you know, the whole system around us is full of that cliche, that stereotype, and this kind of unthinking assumption. This comes back to Alexandra's point, right? It's this unthinking assumption that like, if you're this, you know, a Lebanese woman writing about XYZ, then, you know, it must be because of this or for this or whatever. And it's just not, in the case of the one that I'm talking about, what she's doing. I mean, she's doing a psychological portrait. And her other novel, my other example, is different but similar in that, you know, this is also, because this is what she does, right? A really intense psychological portrait of a woman. And so it's probably, you wouldn't call it like genre fiction or whatever, but a lot of the novel is what's happening in her own head. So she like makes up stories and she has these different lives that she lives in her own head. And so there's this thing where there's characters, are they real or are they only in her head, or who's real and who's not real, right? So there's all of this kind of thing going on, and it's kind of like, you know, complicated, right? Because it's a novel. And so for me, in the process that I went through in editing it, a copy editor basically, you know, to make the story short, tried to edit all that out of it, right? And it's like, but that's the whole thing. So if you don't want the kind of, what, you know, I forget the word used, but, you know, this kind of like meandering kind of story where you can't really understand who's saying what, I mean, that's what the novel's doing. So if you don't want that, then you don't want this novel, and you can't translate. I mean, again, if we're ethical translators or whatever, you can't translate the parts of the novel that make the novel out of the novel, because then you don't have the novel anymore. And I think, like, again, you know, I don't want to like over exaggerate it, but this like subtly and sometimes explicitly is something that we go over like again and again, and we face it in all these different ways. So like, you know, you can see from like what Alexandra and Dima said, like from different perspectives, we're kind of seeing and observing some of the same things, right? I'm gonna like transition that into my my questions, or, you know, the ideas that I had to put back to Dima and Alexandra. I wanted to go back to a point that Alexandra made and a point that Dima made, and maybe bring them together. I guess, you know, I was thinking about one of the questions people often ask me as a translator is, you know, how you kind of choose the works that you translate. And, you know, so I have like that kind of like micro answer for myself, but connecting it back to this point that you two both made in a different way is about thinking about like what gets translated in a bigger picture, like if we observe kind of what gets translated. And, you know, it's sort of interesting because like for myself, right, I choose things that I like. I choose things that I want to do, right? You're spending, you know, time, like considerable time. If you're like really working on a translation, you're immersing in the context, you really get into the book, you read it like lots and lots and lots of times. So you have to like it enough to want to read it over and over again. You maybe want to engage the author, you know, there's all those different things. So I'm choosing things like, you know, for example, that would be, you know, like have funny, sarcastic humor, or a social commentary, or leftist politics, or a feminist criticism, like, you know, just for example, maybe those would be things that I would like. So if I'm a translator then who translates a lot, those elements are going to be things that get represented or overrepresented because I am a translator, if that's what I'm doing, right? If we are a certain number of people. So we just thinking about like, as you know, as translators, we have a certain like power in shaping what gets translated because we're choosing what to translate. So at the same time, so there's like the translators, then there's what the editors edit, and then there's what the publishers are willing to publish, right? There's lots of different levels of this. I'm not saying that it all, you know, rests in one place, but I wanted to kind of bring up like a couple of different examples of or a couple of different parts of the process to think about. And then lead into this question that I wanted to pose back to also Dima and Alexandra of like, what is, what do you observe or what do you think about this question of kind of like what's getting translated, how and why we translate things. And one way I thought about phrasing this is, you know, is Arabic or how is Arabic different from other languages, right? So we observe and we notice that the like field of Arabic English translation is not the same as the fields of translation from other languages. And so what are some of the things that make it different? Should we be embracing those? How should we be dealing with those? Should we be trying to be more like other, translated fields? Like, I think sometimes we think, oh, well, we'll become like, language X translated into English, and our kind of things should be more like them. But then is that really what we want to do? How does that connect to this idea of translation being part of like activism? Like, should we be trying to make Arabic literature mainstream? Should we be trying to be like published and like on the shelves of all the bookshops? Should we be not trying to? Should we be trying to make Arabic niche and very particular? Should we be trying to kind of get a seat at the table in American literary conversations, or should we not? Like, so like those kinds of questions, like what is it like that we are doing, but maybe also a little bit like what should we be doing? How should we be thinking about those things in the field of Arabic English translation? I can't remember who I'm supposed to turn to. Alexandra, what do you think?
Hey, Michelle, yeah, I love what you said. And I'm just going to jump on your question. You have so many things that I want to comment about. Maybe we should just like have another session after this together. But you said, how is Arabic different from other languages? And that really kind of stood out to me because I recently translated, I'm writing a book in Arabic and I needed to apply to something and they wanted a writing sample. So I just translated part of my book. And it was a really interesting exercise because I never really translated. I mean, it's really strange to translate yourself, especially before it's already published. So you can like change what you want. I did not do that. I just translated it and finished it. And then I started to really explore like, how can I tell this story in a different language, especially in a language that I speak really well. I'm, like it's my professional language too. I live here. And so what would this story look like? And it was shocking. You could just like, you develop characters differently. It's not just how language is different, it's how time is different. How do you kind of create the plot in a different way? What do you highlight? What kinds of characters do you develop? How do you approach emotions, right? Like, how do you approach fear? What are the cues for fear? How do you approach, I don't know, I don't really write so much romance, but like, let's say, how do you write romance, right? Like, it's not just the language itself, it's also what, like the language as a vehicle and how it constructs these things. And I think like in the blurb for the event, there was, and I think both of you, Dima and Michelle, mentioned this a little bit about world literature and kind of where is Arabic vis-a-vis world literature. And from my experience, especially in the American Academy, the kind of those discussions are really quite preliminary because you're always asked, I had this once in a job talk actually, like you're always asked to kind of give the Flaubert of Arabic, like an example of who the Flaubert of Arabic is or who the Garcia Marquez of Arabic is. And I think, and also there's this idea kind of alongside that of the fact that, well, we don't really have, like the Arabic novel is always experimental because it doesn't follow the blueprint of the actual novel, right? So, I mean, I think this is really a dead end and we should kind of really flip the script and ask, what can the Arabic novel give world literature? How can it be generative to it and not like, how can it fit into it? Like, they don't need to like make a little space for us and fluff the pillows, but we kind of, what do we give? So, so I think there's this idea that novels can only be written in one way. And it's an idea that's also supported by the fact that in English, for example, writing novels is an industry in a way that it doesn't exist in Arabic. Everybody keeps saying there's so many prizes in Arabic. There are not that many prizes. And most writers don't really make money from their writing. They have a day job. I'm really happy that my day job is a university day job where I get to write academic books and talk about literature, but not everybody has that. And so, like this idea that there's only one way to write a novel is a very dangerous one. And what Arabic literature can give to world literature is different ways of writing novels, different ways of approaching the real, not reality necessarily, but, truths about existing, truths about being in the world, political truths, humor. You mentioned humor, Michelle. It's just, I don't know. I mean, I'm funnier in Arabic when I did this translation exercise, but you can be also funny in English. You can't crack the same joke really, but except rarely. So I think, like from my point of view, it's just, there's this discrepancy, but maybe the translators can also talk about the translation industry, but there's a discrepancy between how developed, for better or for worse, the kind of the English speaking industry of translation and writing is, and how preliminary it is in Arabic, because it really is that. Also, for better or for worse, you can have immense freedom in what you're doing. You can invent words, you can invent structures much more easily. So yeah, I don't know if Dima, you have anything to add to that. Or...
Yeah, I mean, there's so much here to think about, and I think to a certain extent to think about kind of the question of like the charge of the translator, of Arabic literature, to a certain degree. I think, to come to the question, say, of like feminism or a kind of the activism of translation, I think there was a lot of work done, especially in the 80s and the 90s, to try to kind of like flip or change, the predominantly male canon. And I think that of course, a lot of work has been done in that regard. But I think this is also one of the presumptions that a lot of critics and publishers make, that, that the translation market is disproportionately like weighed in the favor of women writers, which is not true. But even if it were, right, if women writers are confined to a very limited, or confined to very limited genres anyway, where are we going to see those changes, I think. And I think, Alexandra, your energy around, these questions is contagious. And because I have a very cynical kind of view and outlook, but it's like you gave me like a vaccine, or like a shot of inspiration to kind of to really, because I focus so much on the problems, because I really see how many problems there are in the field, and it feels sometimes that it's like being in the weeds, like it's so difficult to kind of look out and to see kind of the potential for change that I really don't, I don't really see that kind of happening. To come back to the question around genre, I always think about like our colleagues who are in the Arab world, who are teaching Arabic literature and who are themselves, translators or critics of Arabic literature, or themselves academics. They're part of a literary market that includes books, that you might browse in a bookstore, right? That you might browse in a kind of on a normal day in a bookstore, that you would see, to books that are being reviewed for journals or newspapers, or books that are being, say, reviewed for prize submission. But, where someone, sitting, let's say in Middle America, or, who spent a few months in Egypt, doesn't know what Arabic readers are reading. This is a big issue, I think, that the field really faces. And I think we don't talk enough about that, and I think to a certain extent, these are the stakeholders, they're making those kinds of decisions. I think about the students that I'm teaching, they're graduating from here with 4 years of Arabic, and they feel very entitled to translate, to translate Arabic literature. And I, those are the kinds of questions that actually keep me up at night, because, there's a way that, of course, because of their subject positions, those are the novels that are going to be picked up for translation. So I don't know, Michelle, if you have any final things to say about that, but I hope the audience can, re-steer the
well, yeah, I was going to say, I was like looking at our time. I mean, I have a lot of things to say about that, but rather than maybe launch into it, like maybe we should see what other people want to say, and maybe we can weave some of the answers into that, into seeing what some of the people who are, audience want to talk about, because that's a really interesting question. That I'm sure like me and Alexandra could talk about for like another 2 hours. So let's maybe see what Is Sean, who's moderating the questions?
Yeah, I'll do the
Okay.
moderation for you.
Okay.
So you can just worry about answering the questions.
Okay.
So I guess we're at the time now. If you have questions, please either raise your hand and I'll unmute you, I suppose, or if you want to put your questions in the chat, I'll read them on your behalf. Sorry. So Riham, I'll unmute you.
Yes, I want really to comment on the idea of two ideas. Number one, the translation industry of Arabic literature in translation, because somehow the liberty with which the students or not a native speaker takes into translate with Arabic, it's a bit for me as an Egyptian and Arabic, a native speaker of Arabic, would be extreme, and as a matter of fact, translation specialist, because I'm an associate professor of translation and of cultural studies and translation at Alexandria University, Egypt. This would be extremely problematic, because on if we just reverse the situation, for instance, the publisher who really monopolized or who has monopolized the market for translating Arabic in translation for a long time was the AUC Press. And the AUC Press, whenever she auditioned somebody who's translating from Arabic into English, it's always a native speaker of English. And lately, if you just follow the editions and what gets translated, as a matter of fact, you get that what gets translated is very much would fall into what in translation theory would termed as domestication, meaning you are sort of translating in accordance to the target culture, which index really hegemony. For instance, Marlene Booth, when she was translating Girls of Riyadh, it wasn't the AUC Press, but it was another publishing house. She even lament that the publisher and the para-translator, they sort of watered down the culture-specific item. And the question here, or the question posed earlier, that somehow the student who after the English-speaking student who after 4 or 5 years took a training in Arabic language and thus takes the liberty to translate, of course, because it's a very good market nowadays, Arabic literature in translation, despite what has been, because I'm specialist on the subject, despite what has been really said, no, as Marlene Booth would have put it, the English-speaking world and the publishing industry is going for the next Arabic bestseller. And when they go for the next Arabic bestseller, somehow they are stereotyping or adding to the stereotypical image of the Arab construction, and the translation is always done in accordance to politics and hegemony. Something that doesn't happen, for instance, when I'm translating into English, from English to Arabic, we always, for instance, the National Council of Translation in Egypt would get you that the translator would be a native into Arabic, would be a native of Arabic language. And definitely this pinpointed asymmetrical power relation where I'm translating into English from Arabic, I need a native speaker or at least somebody who's enough trained into both language. Because recently, and this is one of the research that I have done a paper on, we get somebody who's Jonathan Swift, yes. He translated, for instance, Ibrahim Isa, he's an Egyptian journalist writer, Maulana into tele-evangelist, and sort of preserving culture specificity is no longer taken into perspective. His attitude towards translation himself, he said that if you want to translate from Arabic to English, you don't need to have a fluent knowledge of Arabic, which really takes the language very slightly. And for me, that's very much very hegemonic of reckless attitude towards translating culture, because you tend to water down the culture specificity if we're talking in connection with word literature. word literature is about culture specificity and multiculturalism. If you are translating in terms of domesticating the foreign or the other, the exotic, according to the premises of the communication of the Anglo-American English-speaking word, then you are domesticating the other, so to speak. In that case, you're translating in the terms of power and translating in accordance to power, which really is not the responsibility of the translator himself or herself, because there is a lot of web of para-translator that package and stereotype and review, which is the issue of patronage comes in here. Hello?
Hi, thank you so much for your question, Iham. Actually, I'm so glad you brought this up because it's really, you know, like harkens back to a lot of the discussions that Michelle and I have had over the years, because, you know, like obviously there's a politics to translation, obviously there's the other, obviously there's the objectification of another culture. But at the same time, from the point of view of the authors who are working in Arabic, for example, I mean, some of us at least, when I hear cultural specificity and preserving cultural specificity, I'm kind of always on the fence about this, because what the novels are trying to do is kind of, you know, like look at this culture in a different way, critique certain things about this culture, try to redefine what we can talk about and what we cannot talk about in this culture. What is adab in like both the terms of like polite conduct, but also literariness, right? Like we're trying to change things from within. And so, you know, like there's always, whenever you're trying to translate, there's always this kind of movement towards preserving something. And I'm very interested in this tension that develops. And I'm wondering if Michelle and Dima have something to say about that. And sorry for speaking too much. I know I spoke a lot and we have a lot of questions.
Do you want to go ahead, Dima? Do you want to say?
I'm good. I think because I'm, you know, I'm going to steer it in a particular way, and I really want to give people an opportunity to ask questions.
So should we take a few more?
Yeah, I think
maybe we could collect a couple at the same time.
Yes, sounds good.
Sean, if we can collect a couple of questions, and then we can comment. So for time.
Yeah, that
Sure.
sounds
okay.
good.
Anissa Daoudi, would you like to?
Hi, my name is Anissa Daoudi. I'm from the University of Birmingham in the UK. So I thought I'll engage with you just probably to give you the picture of what's going on in the UK here. Basically, and also would like to share the ideas that Michelle has brought up, which are basically, which are related, specifically related to the prizes that are, to my view, not only monopolizing what gets translated, but they're also maybe helping in deteriorating the taste of Arabic literature. I don't think that we get the best. These prizes, as we know, they have been politicized and they have been basically used and abused. We know that. Another related idea is this monopoly of also translators and agents who get the monopoly of who translates. And it's, as the previous speaker said, usually native speakers of English. And I don't think that they even get that humbleness of asking native speakers. It became like a power relationship more than like a noble act of translating and so on. So this is, I thought I'll just engage with you in this on this point. Like I'll give you one example. I worked on a project on the 1990s in Algeria, and I had brought it was a workshop on where I brought together writers and victims who talked about their memories and so on. Cut the story short, this has led to the publishing of a brilliant novel in Arabic. When we came to the translation, this novel has been shortlisted for the Booker Prize. It didn't get it became second. When they wanted to translate it, I just offered help because I know I still have the recordings of the testimonies, and I was there. I'm the one who was funded the project. So I went to the translator and I said, I went to to Banipal and I said, could you kindly put me like link me with the translator just to offer help. I was not going to get paid or anything. And I did specifically say that I was not going to be paid. Yet it was like that arrogance that the novel has been translated in English, again, with all the specificities and all that richness that I probably would have brought in to the translation has been actually most of the time deleted from the translation into English. That's basically. Thank you very much for.
Thank you so much, Anissa. Saeed Muaz Shah, would you like to?
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm actually a unique person in this conversation, probably the least academic, just more of a fan of Arabic translations. I don't know how many I've probably read in my time, though it's of course in a particular genre. I'm actually a professor here at Ziauddin University in Pakistan. Lived most of my life in America, and it's kind of my interest to read Arabic classic Islamic texts translated to English. And I know that's not part of the discussion here, but what's really interesting is, as we know, the whole culture of translation probably started from this, particularly from missionary works when they were going on colonization routes. So I think in a historical context, when we speak about translation, probably that's important. And probably there are literary works like Alf Layla wa Layla, probably as an example in those early days. But I know in the beginning when Sean spoke about the politics of translation, and I don't know if you're aware of the recent law that got passed in Austria about how there's going to be an official translation of the Quran and how that will be kind of promoted in their spaces for that, and how influential that is. And of course that's directly into the politics of translation, and perhaps you can shed a light on that in that discourse. And of course this leads to another question. It's probably the single most significant text in Arabic that has been translated multiple times is the Quran itself. And has there been a comparative study on the translations themselves? Now of course we know that there's of course sect biases and so forth. But aside from that, has there been like a study? I know there's been some kind of papers on, Muslims translation versus someone who's a non-Muslim, but, we have now European Muslims also doing it. So maybe not Arabic speaking Muslims, and that kind of discourse, because a comparative study like that would probably shed more light and give us actual data, speaking about how influential different factors can be, aside from obviously the obvious ones. So maybe perhaps the panelists can speak on that.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Said. I'll take one more question, and then I'll turn it over to the panelists to hear their responses. So Hanan Suleiman, so your hand is raised.
Is she muted? Oh.
Okay, maybe would the panelists like to comment on the previous two questions? Maybe we'll circle back to Hanan.
Would you like to go, Michelle?
I can. Do you want to say something, or would you prefer if I
have a comment, actually, just a very brief one in terms of the Quran. And it's really interesting to think about what translation means, right? Because from a religious point of view, you can't translate the Quran. You can only interpret the Quran. So, right, and it really brings up all those issues of translation and interpretation, and the kind of the porousness of these boundaries that are being discussed right now in, albeit secular literary studies, but they're still being discussed, and we can talk more about that if you like. But I want to hear from Michelle too.
I wasn't gonna say something about that one. I don't know enough about it. I think your point is taken, though, that when we have, one of the things that we observe as people who study the translations of Arabic into English and literary translations is that one thing that we don't have a lot of are multiple translations of the same works. We have very few works that are multiply translated. And so when I was bringing up that point about, oh, do we want to become like other languages? You know, like one of the kind of subtexts of that question is, you know, we don't have like, I don't know, I was just thinking about the translations of Simone de Beauvoir, and, you know, there was like, you know, these different translations of her, and there's like, you know, this ideological bent and that ideological bent, and then there's like debates and there's issues, and, you know, we don't tend to have that. It's like, you know, again, the kind of ideology of translation of Arabic and the way that we read, it's like, we're lucky if we have one translation of a particular work to like debate and talk about. We don't tend to have like multiple ones, you know? And so, but what it does is then it creates a different kind of a vibe, right? Where, and I'm saying this not that there are no works that are multiply translated, but there are relatively few works, right? That we have multiple translations of, right? So obviously a text like the Quran, there are many, but in other kinds of texts, there really aren't. So, I mean, it's an interesting point to bring up, to think about, like when we do translation and we study translation, we think about what translation brings to us, just like Alexandra was saying, you know, what does like Arabic literature, what do Arabic novels or Arabic books that we write offer us, you know, when we look at them, rather than try to make them fit into a mold? Well, what are they doing? And then how does that make a new mold, or how does that make a new kind of commentary? We can think similarly about translations in a certain sense, right? I was gonna also, but I did want to say a word about a point that somebody brought up. I think it was, I'm looking, Anissa Daoudi brought up this point about, or maybe it was also Riham Dabian, the native speakers of English, and this question, like who translates and whatever. And it's a really interesting and big question about how we, you know, think about the kind of like the power in the translation industry, the way that certain people monopolize it, and what kinds of discourses monopolize it, and like individual people, but then also groups of people. And, you know, we don't have time now to go into all of the intricacies of it, but I wanted to propose that we also like think about what we mean when we say native speaker. Like, what does it mean to say that like we're a native speaker of a certain language? I mean, you know, because I think that is how we talk, and that is the discourse that we use. And I think it's one that maybe we could start to, as people in these conversations, like problematize and push for a new way of thinking about, like, because what it, you know, whether or not we have like I mean, I fight with my teenager about this all the time. Like, you know, is, you know, because he likes to say, you know, well, I'm a native speaker, you know, and it's like, are you, you know, so anyway, but, you know, like, what does it mean to be a native speaker, or have this be, you know, your first language? What if you're bilingual? What's your first language? Is it like literally the language that you learn first? You know, if you speak 4 languages, you know, and one you're better at for this and one you're better at for that, right? Like, the reality of the world isn't that we have these like pure beings that have like a certain language that is their language, or what give us an ownership over a certain language or a claim to a certain language. So I wanted to bring that partly because, you know, of a lot of the people that I work with. I wanted to like shout out young translators, new translators, my co-translator who's on the Zoom call, who I've done a couple of works with, right? Like, how do you decide what language you're a native speaker of, right? Maybe you're a native speaker of more than one. So I wanted to put that out there, but I wanted to put it out there and then just nuance it with one point, and then I'll stop, is that you know, part of the dynamic of the translation process that you go through when you know, like I said, you know, you let's say translate something, and then you have this text, and then you go through these other steps. So you have a copy editor and an editor and a publisher, and, you know, there might be more people who read this text, and there's debates and discussions and so on that happen. And this might happen between an author and a translator, like Alexandra and I did this when we were, you know, working on her text. So, you know, there's lots of people who you might discuss your translation with, but I'm really interested in that kind of relationship with these editors who have a fair amount of say over the final shape of a text. Sometimes, depends on who you're translating with. I've been in a lot of discussions and negotiations with these editors, okay? And I've really observed over time this dynamic whereby the editor is always, in my experience that I've dealt with, a native speaker of English who very much bases and formulates their arguments on that fact. So, maybe any of us in this room today can make a certain claim to English, but we might or might not base our claim to doing something on that fact, right? And so the arguments and the discussions and the debates that happen are, you can't say that because a native speaker of English wouldn't understand it, or you can't do this challenging thing in your translation, or you can't, if we come back to your terminology, Riham Debian, like the, domestication or foreignization, you can't do something that's unusual or challenging or that I don't like in your translation because I'm telling you that reader of English can't understand it, right? Because I am a native speaker of English. I don't know Arabic. Like, I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about this editor. The editor comes to the translator and says, well, I don't know Arabic, but I know you can't say that in English. Okay. And so there's this debate and this discussion that happens.
What if you can't? Like,
well,
let's find a way to say it,
Well, so my thing is like, use your imagination or Google, and figure it out. Like, that's sort of my argument back. But I think that, but it's interesting because, it puts me, for example, like, it's sort of like, as a translator, and I'm all aware of these dynamics, then do I argue back, well, I'm just as much of a native speaker as you. I didn't know another language until like, do you argue on this basis of like cultural ignorance? Like, do you argue on the basis of not knowing as much so that you can have more credibility, or I know a lot of people who never ever spoke anything other than English. Like, what kind of basis are we making our arguments on as a claim to a language? I think it's like we don't like to talk in these terms, but so on the one hand, like in the translation process, you're supposed to know more languages, but then there's this other level where your credibility comes from not knowing. Your credibility comes from being monolingual, monocultural, which seems to me, again, when we think about who's our imagined reader, problematic. Like, my imagined reader maybe isn't somebody who's never, maybe my imagined reader speaks 8 languages, right? I mean, a lot of my students speak multiple languages. Why would other people out there not speak multiple languages, Anyway, so I thought I'd throw that out there because I think that it's one of those unproblematized things that we do tend to fall back on. And yes, I wasn't speaking to you, saying that you're doing this, but I'm saying that we do it, right? We do it in our processes, and that, like, I've been interpolated into it so many times and had to fight the desire to just like be like, no, like, I speak only one language, and I'm telling you this, right? Because you want to argue back on that same basis, and can we change and shift the conversation? That was what I was trying to say for that.
If I may jump in here really quickly before we take another question or comment, I think one thing very concretely that I'd like to see is a kind of normalization, not only of multiple translations, and I think you're right. There are a limited number of translations that exist like in multiples. So, and even when those exist, there's a lot of sensitivities around that because, again, we're talking about a 50 to 70 year span. So some of the people who translated, let's say, Mahfouz in the 70s or 80s, some of them are still alive. And so when some, an up and coming translator is like, actually, I'm going to translate Madak Ali, there is some sensitivity around that. So I think, personally, it would be great if we can normalize these practices and not really kind of, and I think if there are multiple translations, I think the sensitivities around having, multiple translations of also not just Mahfouz, of course, others, I do think, I think that could be a really important shift for the field. The other thing I think that should be normalized is the critical reviews of translation. So, and I think that could really extend to the culture of the editing. I think you're absolutely right, Michelle, that on the, that's really where the work is happening. That those are the people that are making the final decisions, I think. And I think that we also don't have a culture of, reviewing translations. That's not, again, based on whether the translator knew what, the difference between ra'ba or rukba is, right? So I think we can, I think we should really push for, critical reviews within the field. We can really stand to benefit from that. So those are just like two concrete things I personally see as, perhaps, in a way to kind of implement some of the shifts that I think Alexandra is hoping for and talking about and sort of imagining, right? How can we imagine those possibilities? I think there are concrete ways to do that already.
I actually want to talk about another possibility if we have a bit of time. And also, first to your question, Michelle, there's this fetishization of the idea or the ideal of a native speaker that really, really actually bothers me, because I think, like in order to push back against the grammar of a language, in order to kind of write more freely in it, you actually have to let go of all of those structures that you are educated within in order to come up with new ways of expressing things. So then like all of your work gets muddled up and like brought back into a very standardized way of speaking when it's translated, and that's really problematic. So there's so many things to say about the native speaker, but I really want to bring in this sort of porousness of literature and the adaptation of literature, either through the internet or through kind of like films. An example is Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq's 81-volume sci-fi kind of like compendium of global lore that was really beloved by its young adult intended readers in Egypt, especially in the kind of the 1990s and the 2000s, but abhorred by the culture industry in a way, because it wasn't political enough, it wasn't literary enough. And suddenly it's having this renaissance now. Like there are hundreds of Facebook groups that are kind of talking about it, and blogs and the internet are kind of collapsing that kind of the difference between popular and high art. And it was adapted to Netflix, and now it's kind of like at the fingertips of anybody who wants to watch it with a Netflix subscription around the world. And so like, how do we get out of the classroom in terms of translating and adapting and making Arabic literature available using media? My students, I assigned it to my students, and the paranormal Netflix adaptation, and some of them watched it dubbed, which is another way of adapting and translating. It's just this brave new world of changes and potentialities. And I really wanted to mention that in our discussion, just because, like, it would really push us to think about translation and intercultural exchange in very different ways. Yeah.
Wonderful. Hanan, your mic is working now?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yes, greetings. Thank you. Good day. Thank you for an excellent seminar and wonderful inputs from the speakers and attendees. My name is Hanan. I'm from Egypt. I'm a journalist. And I have a few questions about the best way kind of like to approach translation opportunities, like where or how to look, how to pick a good publisher. Alexandra also mentioned something about how to translate something from a culture. Of course, this was like the main issue of the seminar, how to translate something from a culture that you're not familiar with. And also one of the attendees raised the same issue in her experience in translating a text that was later changed in a way that diminished its cultural uniqueness. Given that, is it better if writers, like original publishers also, take care of the translation, then find a publisher abroad? Like speaking of the native speakers thing, shall we maybe do a cultural translation like locally, then do editing by a native speaker kind of the language the book is translated to? I'm personally interested in the translation process. Maybe I have some basic questions that I raised in the beginning, but this is mainly for my novel that I recently published, my first one, and it is on spiritual abuse. Thank you very much.
What is your novel called?
It's called The Rai, the shepherd. Thank you.
I mean, I think it's hard to give like a general advice, right? Because there's so many of the different, factors that go into those processes, right? But one of the things that I think is that you kind of bring out that I wanted to talk about, we didn't have time yet, so that's why I like jumped on there, is thinking, when we think about different ways to make translations work and to make translations better, is ideas about kind of how you find the right person to translate, or how you find the right translation situation for a particular book or for yourself or for whatever. So like Alexandra gave us the experience, which I thought was so interesting and so real, right? From talking to other authors who've translated their own work, of how strange it is to translate your own work. There are a few people who do it really well. But it's like everyone describes it as this very strange experience. And I've worked with authors who don't even really like to read the translation. Actually, you might even be one, like who don't even really like to read the translation, right? That somebody else has done, because it's just so strange, right? The experience of reading something that's the same and not the same, right? It's right. But I wanted to just come back to that idea, because I said it before about like working with more than one person, right? Like working with a co-translator. So recently I've worked together with a co-translator who was here. I no longer see all the names, but Colleen Nasrallah, we've worked together now on 2 translations. And, you know, it's been a really interesting experience, kind of, whereas a lot of translation one does alone, right? And, you know, you call people or you talk, like Dima said, you know, we've worked together on translation. You know, you do a translation and somebody reads it and then you debate bits of it, or you talk about bits of it. But these 2 works that I translated with Colleen, we did them together, right? So we worked on them, like the whole thing from start to end together, you know, discussing like more or less every single word. So as you can imagine, it's very time consuming, but it's interesting because like for me, you know, the process really teaches a lot about, you know, so we didn't particularly disagree very often about things, but we very often just had different ideas, right? We just read it different. We had a different a word. It's like, oh yeah, yours is good. No, yours is good. You know, like you have that, or, you know, it makes you think about a different thing. And just even that shows you so much about how translation isn't just moving this and making it this. Right? It's just not a linear, like there's a right answer, you know, there's not one answer, there's not one right answer. So this is, I mean, I'm making your problem harder, Hanan Suleiman, than what you started with, right? But it's sort of saying, like, there's just a lot of different things to keep in mind about translation, that it's such a complex process. And so to really, when you're thinking about, you know, having your book translated or translating a book, or, you know, reading translations of it, just remembering that like there's so many pieces of it and parts of it to think about, and which parts do you care the most about, and like what are the ways to get to to where you want it to be. I mean, that's micro, but I just thought it was a bit connected to the question you were asking, even though it didn't answer it.
Well, to speak to Hanan's question, I don't know, Hanan, if you're still there. Did you publish them? Is it published in Arabic right now, your novel?
It is, yes.
Okay, congratulations. That's amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, like maybe start with talking to the publisher themselves, you know, like now more and more people who are writing in Arabic are getting agents, right? There's only one agency. It's called Raya. I mean, that I know of. And most people... Raya? Yeah, and most people who kind of have an agent and write in Arabic are under the auspices of that agency. So like, talk to them, you know. But from my experience, I mean, maybe the publishing world is really changing, especially kind of like, we're talking about agents, we're talking about it becoming more industrialized, the prizes, things like that. But in my experience, it's also a lot about, I mean, for better or for worse, I'm sorry if this is not like concrete advice, but it's really about personal connection as well. And yeah, maybe ask your publisher about book festivals that they participate in, maybe participate in book festivals, and, you know, try to get your book out there. And yeah, what's the publisher? I would love to read it.
Please, it's called Dara للنشر والتوزيع. It's in Egypt. Mm-hmm. You can easily find it on Goodreads, inshallah. Okay. And yeah.
Okay,
thanks for your interest. Thank you.
Yeah.
Shukran.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Okay, so I hate to do this because it's been so much fun, but we're really down to the wire. We're actually over time at this point. So maybe I'll just read one recent comment, and then 3 of you perhaps would like to say something about it. So Sheila Ameri writes, I was curious about audiobook narrations. I've listened to a couple, and although I'm not proficient in Arabic, I really struggled to hear the anglicization of the Arabic names, places. I wonder if collaborative choice of narrating actor is of the Arabic-speaking author, the translator, or just the Anglophone publishing company. audiobooks are getting more popular as a medium, which can impact how the novel is interpreted. For example, I was really annoyed with Frankenstein and Baghdad's narrator. I don't know.
That is true that in audiobooks are really, you know, that's an area, the digitization world is really, there's a lot of movement there, especially from the Gulf region. Also, Yasmina Jalisati, the agent of Raya, is actually working on this element of audiobooks. Yeah, I think collaborative initiatives are great. So I have also listened to a few novels on audiobooks, and I agree with you that it grits sometimes when with the anglicized pronunciations of Arab names, and you know, so I hope that, you know, because there's so much attention there, that, you know, this is one way that it's very easy to fix this. You know, of course, like there's so many more, you know, native speakers of Arabic who also speak English very well. You know, so I hope that this is one area that, you know, those in charge of, you know, of this audiobook industry can really kind of turn their attention there, if they're out there listening, please.
Yeah, I wonder if it would be a good idea to kind of use a narrator with an accent, because it fetishizes, but at the same time, it's kind of like more realistic. I don't know, but I've never heard of an audiobook, but I talked about the dubbing just a little bit ago. And my students who are native speakers of English were really, really kind of weirded out by the dubbing, because like even in the very beginning, it starts with a game of hide and seek, and it's like, Khalawis, Lisa. And in English, it's like, ready or not? And they were like, it's too cheery. Like it was really not in place. And I was really glad that they noticed that, even like not really knowing Arabic at all. So I think people are aware of this problem. And like Dima said, there are so many ways of solving it, and it will probably be solved soon.
Well, like anecdote, I have a friend, actually someone who Dima knows, who was, you know, did one of these like reading ones. And when he was reading, he's a native speaker of both English and Arabic, but who, as he was reading, they were like trying to get him to like, you know, make his Arabic accent stronger.
Yeah.
You see, that comes to Alexandra's point. And so like, we just teased him a lot, you know, for a long time, like, you know, when you pronounce certain words, you have to really make it stronger to show, you know, but I think, you know, it's really worth, especially for, because it seems like we have some authors out there as well. You know, my guess is that it's, especially if these are larger publishers, that there is not a lot of collaborative choice going on, that the choice of who's the actor or who reads, like, and that it's not probably made very often in a kind of like collaborative conversational way, and that it's actually decided at a certain level. And so it's really something I would say to keep, you know, and that's for translators too, but, you know, for authors to keep your eyes open as you sign contracts or as you go forward with different, and ask those questions. Like, if it becomes an audiobook, do I get a say? You know, do I get a right of rejection? You know, and that goes from everything from, you know, audiobook to other elements of the book as well, that, you know, with all the kind of commercialization, corporatization, and the kind of influence that those have over the production of literature and creative arts, you know, to try to hold on to whatever rights over your own work that you might want to have, because otherwise you won't.
And there are efforts now, you know, to organize, especially translators, in relationship, you know, in relation to contracts and that kind of thing. I think that's one positive thing I could see happening. And so I think organizing could be a really important way to, you know, to mitigate some of these tensions and problems.
Wonderful. Thank you so very, very much. We don't seem to have any more questions or comments, which is shocking. Congratulations to you three. I think it's a wrap. Unless
we have solved all the issues.
Sorry?
We have solved all the issues.
Yeah. Now we can get back to translating.
Writing.
Yeah, in writing. So thank you so very much to the three of you, Michelle, Dima, and Alexandra. And thank you so much to everybody who came to this session and lending us your 2 hours of this wonderful Friday.